My brother watched me fall down 12 steps and didn't reach for his phone for 3 minutes. I counted. I was lying at the bottom of the staircase in our childhood home, my right arm twisted beneath me at an angle it was never meant to hold, and I could see his shoes at the top of the landing, brown, leather loafers, the ones I had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. He stood there long enough for me to understand that the fall wasn't an accident. Then he called 911, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was crying. He was always a very good crier. I am 31 years old, and I manage property acquisitions for a real estate investment firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know how to read a contract the way other people read a text message. I know when numbers have been moved, when signatures don't sit right on a page, when the story someone is telling doesn't match the documentation underneath. I had spent 6 years developing that skill professionally. It never once occurred to me that I would need it to protect myself from the person who used to carry me on his shoulders when I was 4 years old. 3 weeks before my fall, our mother had passed away after 18 months of fighting lung cancer. She was 63 years old, and she spent her last coherent weeks making sure everything was in order. She told me personally, in the hospital room, with the afternoon light coming through the blinds, that she had updated her will. The house was to be split equally between my brother and me. The savings account, the jewelry, the car. Equal. She reached out and held my hand when she said it, and I remembered thinking it was strange, the way she held on a little too tight, like she was trying to pass something through her palm into mine. I didn't understand what she was trying to warn me about until I was sitting in the probate attorney's office, and the will they presented to me was not the one my mother had described. According to the document on the table, I was to receive my mother's car, a 2017 Honda Accord, with a cracked side mirror and a modest sum of $4,000. My brother was to receive the house, the land it sat on, and the entirety of the savings account, which I only later discovered had grown to just over $220,000. The attorney slid the papers toward me with the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as bad. My brother sat across from me with his hands folded on the table, watching my face. He was looking for grief. Instead, he saw something shift behind my eyes that he didn't recognize. He should have recognized it. He had seen it in our mother's face every time she caught him in a lie. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I thanked the attorney, shook his hand, and walked to my car. I sat in the parking garage for 45 minutes, not falling apart, thinking. I pulled up the photos on my phone. I had photographed my mother's actual will during one of my visits to the hospital, the version she had walked me through herself, the one with the attorney's embossed seal in the bottom left corner and her shaking signature above the date. November 14th. The document on the table today was dated November 2nd, 12 days earlier, when my mother was still well enough to be coherent but had not yet had the specific conversation with me. The paper was right. The seal looked right, but my mother's signature on the fraudulent version had an upward loop on the capital S of her last name that she had stopped writing sometime in her 40s when a wrist injury changed her grip. I had seen her sign her name hundreds of times. The signature in the attorney's office belonged to a different version of a woman who no longer existed. My brother had forged our mother's will. I drove home and sat in my kitchen until midnight, and then I called my friend Marcus, who had spent 15 years as a forensic document examiner before opening his own private consulting firm. I called my attorney, a woman named Diane who had helped me navigate 2 contentious commercial property disputes and did not rattle easily. I didn't tell either of them everything that night. I just asked them both to be available the following week, and I told them both that the matter was urgent and that I needed them to keep the conversation between us. Then I did something that I think confused my brother more than anything that came later. I called him and told him I was fine. I told him I understood that our mother had made her choices and I wasn't going to contest anything. I told him I missed him and that grief was hard and that I wanted us to get through this together. He paused for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said he was relieved. He said it had been weighing on him. He said he wanted the same thing. I said I knew. The house needed to be cleared out before it could be listed. My brother called 2 days later and asked if I would come help sort through the remaining boxes in the upper rooms. He said his wife had been overwhelmed by it all and that it would mean a great deal to him to have me there. The house held 30 years of our family's accumulation photographs and furniture, and the particular smell of the carpet in the hallway that I had never been able to identify anywhere else. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I had grown up in that house. I had my own reasons for wanting to be inside it one more time. What I didn't know was that my brother had made a phone call the week prior to a man he owed money to. A significant amount of money. The kind that accumulates when someone has spent 4 years making quiet, confident bets on outcomes that keep not arriving. I learned later from Marcus, who had spent 3 days following a paper trail through secondary bank accounts, that my brother owed a little over $90,000 to 2 separate creditors, one of whom had recently stopped accepting installment payments. The inheritance wasn't greed in the abstract. It was a deadline. The staircase in our mother's house was narrow, with a slight curve at the top and a wooden handrail that had always been slightly loose on the left side. I knew this. I had grown up in that house. What I didn't know was that my brother had come by 2 days before and removed the single screw that had been keeping the right side bracket anchored to the wall. I didn't know because I wasn't looking for it. I was carrying a box of my mother's winter coats toward the spare room when my brother called my name from the bottom of the stairs. And I turned, and the railing gave way, and the 12 steps came up very fast. I remember the ceiling. I remember the brown loafers. I remember counting the seconds and arriving at a number that told me everything I needed to know about what my life was worth to the person wearing them. I spent 4 days in the hospital with a fractured radius, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion severe enough that the neurologist wanted to monitor me overnight twice. My brother visited once. He brought flowers and a card. His wife did not come. He sat beside the bed and held my good hand and told me it was a terrible accident and that he felt so guilty. He should have had the railing fixed months ago. His voice was exactly right. The timing of his pauses was exactly right. If I hadn't been lying there running through the mathematics of his debt and his motive and the 12 seconds he had stood at the top of the stairs, I might have found it comforting. Instead, I looked at him and I thought, "You have made a significant mistake." The mistake was not the forged will, though that was criminal. The mistake was not the loose railing, though that was worse. The mistake was that he thought I was the same person I had been at 22, when I deferred to him on everything because he was older and our mother expected me to, because the family architecture had always placed him slightly above, and I had grown up tilting my head up to hear him speak. He still saw that version of me. He had not updated the image. He did not know that the woman lying in that hospital bed had spent a decade learning how to read a room, a contract, and a face all at once. He did not know that I had quietly photographed the will, quietly called Marcus, quietly started building a file before the funeral flowers had even finished wilting. He thought he had already won. That was the only advantage I needed. Diane filed a petition to contest the will on the grounds of suspected fraud. Marcus submitted a preliminary forensic analysis, identifying 6 specific inconsistencies in the signature and 2 anomalies in the paper stock, suggesting the document had been printed on a machine different from the one used for notarized pages. The probate court issued a hold on all asset transfers pending investigation. This meant my brother could not touch the house, could not touch the savings account, could not pay his debts. I was told by someone close to the situation that he did not take this news calmly. Diane called me the morning after the hold was issued and told me in her level, careful way that my brother had come to her office unannounced and had to be escorted out by the building's security. She said he had been loud. She said the words he used were not things she would repeat in a professional context. I thanked her and told her to document everything. She said she already had. My brother called me that night. It was the first time since the hospital visit. His voice had changed. The carefully measured grief was gone. What was underneath it was something tighter, more pressurized, the way a pipe sounds right before it fails. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me this was family business and I was dragging it into a courtroom and it would destroy what was left of us. He told me our mother would be horrified. I said very little. I told him I was sorry he was upset. I told him I hoped we could resolve things fairly. I let him talk, and I let the silence do the rest of the work. And when he finally stopped, I said goodnight, and I hung up. What I did not tell him was that Marcus had, by this point, confirmed something new. The security camera at the copy and print shop 4 blocks from our mother's hospital had captured footage of a transaction on November 1st, 1 day before the fraudulent wills date, in which a man matching the brother's description had used the self-service scanner and printer for 11 minutes. Marcus had requested the file log under a civil discovery subpoena. The print job that day had been a multi-page document on legal weight paper. I sat with this information for 2 days. I sat with it the way I sit with a difficult negotiation before I walk into the room, turning it over, finding its edges, understanding what I had and what I still needed. What I had was enough to build a strong civil case. What I didn't yet have was the thing that would close the criminal question permanently. Diane had told me that document fraud was prosecutable, but that the DA's office would want something more direct. A confession, ideally. Something that removed ambiguity. I thought about how my brother operated. He was not a complicated man beneath the performance. He was someone who had spent his whole life being told he was the smart one, the capable one, the one who would figure it out. He was someone who believed, even now, that the gap between us was still what it had been when we were children. He needed someone to confirm that belief. He needed to hear, from me, that he had outsmarted everyone. I called him on a Tuesday evening. I told him I wanted to talk. Not through lawyers, just the 2 of us. I told him I had been thinking about what he said, about family, and what was left of it, and he had a point. I told him I was tired of fighting. I told him I might be willing to let the petition drop if we could come to a private agreement that gave me something fair. I kept my voice small, a little defeated, the way I had sounded at 22, when the family architecture was still intact. He agreed to meet me at the house the following evening. I arrived an hour early and let Marcus in through the back door. He was there for one reason. He positioned himself in the small utility room off the kitchen, where he had a clear audio line to the living room. He had the equipment he needed. He gave me a nod, and I went to wait at the front door. My brother arrived with a bottle of wine, which I thought was almost impressive in its audacity. He set it on the kitchen counter and looked around the house with the easy proprietary comfort of a man who already considered it his. He had brought his wife. I had expected that. She sat on the couch with her hands in her lap and said very little, which was fine. Her presence didn't change what needed to happen. We sat at the kitchen table. I told him again that I was exhausted, that I had talked to my attorney, and the process was going to take over a year and cost both of us in legal fees. I said I was willing to drop the petition entirely in exchange for $60,000 and my mother's jewelry. I watched him hear the number and do the math. $60,000 was well below what he owed. He could pay his debts, keep the house, keep most of the savings, and make this go away. His wife looked at him. He looked at me. I said, very quietly, that I just wanted to understand one thing. I said I wanted to know why he had done it. Not for the lawyers. Not to use against him. Just for me, so I could close something in my mind and move forward. I told him I needed to understand, as his sister, what had happened. People tell you things when they believe they've already won. He leaned back in his chair and for a moment I saw him the way he must have seen himself, the capable one, the one who had figured it out. He told me that he had been in a difficult position for a long time. He said I had always had it easier. The good job, the apartment, the career. He said the house should have gone to him in full because he had been the one present at the end. He had been the one driving their mother to appointments and managing her care while I sent flowers from Charlotte. He said the will he presented was what their mother had always intended, and he had simply made sure her wishes were honored correctly. I said, so you changed the document yourself? He said he had corrected it. I said the word, forged. He said call it what you want. He said it was already done and the money was already spoken for and dropping the petition was the best possible thing I could do for both of us. He said if I pushed this, he would bury me in a legal fight that would take everything I had. He said he knew things about my work situation that he could use. He leaned forward and lowered his voice, and he told me very clearly that I had no idea what I had started and that I should take the $60,000 and be grateful. I looked at him for a moment. My brother. The person who had carried me on his shoulders when I was 4. The person whose shoes I had stared at from the bottom of 12 steps. I said okay. He started to smile. I said, I'll drop the petition, and I stood up and walked to the door of the utility room and opened it, and Marcus stepped out carrying his equipment, and the expression on my brother's face completed a journey in about 4 seconds, from satisfied, to confused, to something I had never seen on him before. His wife stood up very fast and knocked her wineglass sideways. I told him that I had everything he had just said on record. I told him that Marcus had spent the past 2 weeks building a forensic case that was already in Diane's hands, and that the recording we had just made would be delivered to the district attorney's office the following morning. I told him that the security footage from the print shop had been subpoenaed. I told him that his creditors had already been contacted by one of those creditors' attorneys, who had flagged the hold on the estate as potentially implicating my brother in fraud, and were cooperating with the investigation because they wanted to recover whatever they could. I told him this was over. He came out of his chair fast. His wife grabbed his arm. He shouted things that I won't repeat, not because they were too painful, but because they weren't. They were the words of a man discovering that the person he had been performing competence for had never been the audience he thought. He said I had set him up. He said I had manipulated him. He said if I had just stayed out of it, none of this would have happened. I recognized that logic. The logic that says the person you tried to hurt is responsible for the consequences of your trying. I didn't raise my voice. I told him that the house would be managed by the estate during the investigation. I told him that Diane had already filed the documentation to freeze his personal accounts pending the fraud determination. I told him that I was leaving, and that I strongly suggested he contact an attorney tonight. Then I walked out the front door of my childhood home, and I did not look back at it. The district attorney's office moved quickly once they had the forensic report and the recording. My brother was arrested on charges of will fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, and felony fraud. His wife retained her own attorney within 48 hours, which told me something about the durability of their marriage that I chose not to think about. The staircase railing became a separate investigation. The bracket removal was deliberate and documentable, and the charge that followed was criminal negligence causing bodily injury, which carried its own sentencing weight. I was present in the courtroom for the arraignment. I watched the bailiff walk him to his place before the judge, and I thought about how small the room was, how ordinary, how the things that feel enormous, the betrayal, the document, the 12 steps, the 3 minutes of brown loafers at the top of the landing, how they collapse into paperwork and procedure, and a court date on a calendar. He did not look at me. I watched him not look at me, and I felt something that I initially mistook for sadness. It wasn't sadness. It was the specific quiet that follows a long and exhausting noise. He accepted a plea agreement 8 months later, 3.5 years, with the possibility of parole at 28 months, given no prior record. He was ordered to repay the full value of the fraudulently redirected estate, including legal costs. The house was placed in a trust to be sold, with proceeds divided according to the original will my mother had actually signed. The savings account, less the legal fees and restitution, came to me in full. His creditors filed a civil suit against him separately. I did not follow the outcome of that suit closely because it was no longer my concern. Diane called me the day the plea was entered, and she used the word congratulations, which surprised me. I told her I wasn't sure that was the right word for it. She said in her experience, it usually was, eventually. I thanked her and I sat on my balcony in Charlotte with a cup of coffee, and I thought about my mother holding my hand in the hospital room, holding on too tight, trying to pass something through her palm. I thought maybe what she was trying to pass was not a warning. Maybe it was just the fact of herself, the specific weight of a person who is leaving and knows it, and who wants to make sure you have felt her hand in yours before she goes. I didn't open the letter my brother sent me from the correctional facility 6 weeks into his sentence. I recognized his handwriting on the envelope, and I stood in my kitchen holding it for a long time, cataloging the feelings without acting on them. There would be an explanation in there, a justification, a version of events in which I was partly responsible, in which the circumstances had forced his hand, in which our mother's choices and our father's absence and financial pressure and stress had conspired to put him in a position where what he did was, if not forgivable, at least understandable. There might even be an apology, though I suspected it would be the kind of apology that was mostly an explanation wearing apology's clothes. I knew, because I knew him, that the letter was designed to produce a response. Any response. Anger, grief, forgiveness, argument, any of them would do. What it could not survive was silence. I folded it in half without opening it and dropped it into the recycling bin under the sink. Not with ceremony. The way you clear a counter. That was the day I understood something that I've tried to explain to a few people since, with mixed success. There is a version of healing that looks the way movies tell us it should look. The confrontation, the tears, the words exchanged, the closing of something. And then there is the other version, which is quieter and harder to explain. It is the morning you wake up and realize you haven't thought about the person in 3 days. It is the moment the anger, which you had been tending carefully like a fire that needed to be kept alive because otherwise what were you doing all of this for, simply goes out on its own. It is the recycling bin under the sink. It is the cup of coffee on the balcony, and the traffic sounds from the street below, and the particular light of an ordinary Tuesday that is not about anyone but you. That is the version I had. It is less dramatic. It is the only kind worth having. If you have gotten this far in my story, there is probably a reason. There is probably someone in your life who has the same quality my brother had, that absolute confidence in his own centrality, the assumption that the architecture of your relationship is fixed and permanent and tilted in his direction. Someone who believes that your patience is infinite, your memory is short, and your perception of events is flexible enough to be rewritten if he tells the story often enough, and with enough conviction. I want to tell you 3 things, because I spent a long time learning them and I think they matter. The first is this. Documentation is not disloyalty. For years I absorbed things quietly because I believed that writing things down, saving messages, photographing documents, that this was a form of bad faith, a preparation for conflict that would itself create the conflict. What I understand now is that documentation is simply memory made durable. It is the refusal to let someone else narrate your life. The moment you start keeping records is not the moment you decide to fight. It is the moment you decide to know what actually happened, regardless of how many times the story gets retold over the dinner table. The second thing is about the architecture I mentioned, the family structure that assigns you a role before you're old enough to choose it. My brother was the capable one. I was the deferred one. That arrangement was decided before either of us had any real say in the matter. And I spent my 20s performing it faithfully because that is what you do with the architecture you're born into. You live inside it without examining it. What I can tell you is that architecture is not load-bearing. You can take it apart. It does not collapse anything real. What it collapses is a fiction that was serving someone else far more than it was ever serving you. The third thing is the one I think about most often, and it is this. You cannot get justice from someone who does not believe they have done anything wrong. This was the most important thing I had to learn about my brother, and I had to learn it the hard way because I kept waiting, in the early months, for some version of him to surface that would recognize what he had done and feel the appropriate weight of it. That version does not exist. It never existed. And once I accepted that, something shifted. I stopped needing him to understand. I stopped needing the conversation that would make everything make sense. I took the evidence I had and I put it in the hands of the people whose job it was to do something with it, and I got out of the way. That is the whole of it, really. Build your case carefully. Put it in the right hands. Get out of the way. My mother's jewelry is in a small box on my dresser. I open it sometimes and look at the pieces without taking them out. The pearl earrings she wore to my college graduation. The thin gold bracelet she bought herself the year she quit smoking. The ring she wore on her right hand for so long that it had shaped a groove in her finger. I could still feel when I held her hand at the end. I open the box and look at these things, and I think about her. Not about the will, not about the hospital room, not about what she may or may not have been trying to tell me. Just about her. The particular way she laughed. The way she made coffee too strong and complained about it being too weak. The way she held on a little too tight. I hold on to that too, now. Not too tight. Just enough to know it was real. I am 31 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. and I manage property acquisitions for a real estate firm. I am very good at reading a contract. I know when numbers have been moved. I know when the story someone is telling doesn't match the documentation underneath. I know what it costs to let go of something that has been holding you down for a long time. And I know what the air feels like after. It feels like a Tuesday morning. It feels like coffee on a balcony. It feels like not very much, which is exactly the point.